Hello, friend. Thanks for joining me for another book chat. Today, let's spend some time with Second Foundation by Isaac Asimov. This book was originally published back in 1953, and I decided to read this because I decided to reread this entire series, and I read the previous two books earlier, and I did chat those, so I will link those chats down in the details below. But I have read this before, so this is a reread for me. I read the first three books in this series many years ago, and so I decided if I was going to read the series, the whole series, the entire series, I would need to reread these first three. So I'm really glad I did, because I did remember. I remember the general gist of this book, but not some of the details. So that was a good to get it reread. So Second Foundation by Isaac Asimov. So this is part of a series, so it becomes a little difficult to chat a series like this without giving away too much, about the plot that might detract from anyone's experience, and I definitely don't want to do that, so I'm going to be careful there. But what this book is basically about is this divided up into two different parts. We have the first part, which is called The Search by the Mule, and then the second part is called The Search by the Foundation. So what's going on here is, in the first part, the mule is searching for the second foundation, and in the second part, it's mainly the first foundation that's searching for the second foundation. And they each have their similar reasons, actually, for searching out the second foundation. So just to recap from the earlier books, it was mentioned that there were two foundations back in book one. There were two foundations that were developed. We're talking about a far future galaxy-wide empire that is in collapse in the first book, beginning to collapse, and it is predicted to collapse through a science known as psychohistory that is developed by a scientist known as Harry Seldon. And he actually understands that if the foundations can be established, then it will decrease the dark age that's going to follow the collapse of this galactic empire. It will decrease this dark age by many thousands of years if the foundation ends up being successful. So there is one foundation that we are aware of as the reader in the first book. In the second book as well, it is on a planet called Terminus. And then in the first book, it was described the second foundation was supposed to be at the far end of the galaxy. So at the other end of the galaxies where we expect it to be, but no one knows its exact location. And so it's out there somewhere, people think. Over the centuries, then the reputation of the first foundation grows a lot. So there's a difference between the foundations. So the first foundation is all about physical science and technology, and so they're very adept at this. They do not have among their ranks any of the psychohistorians or those who are able to interpret the future that Harry Seldon developed. They are all supposed to be in the second foundation, so they're more of a mental, psychological science that they specialize in. So there's two different specialties going on here. So I want to be careful about talking about especially part one and part two, so I'll save that I'll have a little spoiler section after I finish talking about this general part of the book that will talk a little more in depth about these two different parts, but I'll give fair warning before we get there. But just the main theme I think that I took away from this book was whether or not the second foundation actually exists. And we as the reader, as we experience this book in book one, we have information that the characters in the book do not have. So it seems to us that there is a second foundation, but then I was caught myself wondering, I don't know, maybe not. But that sort of tension of whether or not there is actually a second foundation is something definitely the characters are experiencing, and also the reader, as we go along their journey in trying to uncover this. So the mule in part one, is both sorts of the foundation search for the first foundation's search for the second foundation, as well as the Mule's search for the second foundation, is really all about their paranoia about what the second foundation is and what kind of power it will have or has over them. So that's kind of the other main theme that I took away from this book, was this, just the power of the idea that there is something like the second foundation out there that could impact you in some way. So there's a quote that sort of describes this really well, I think, that just how just this very idea can really impact things and impact a person's life individually as well as whole societies. And the quote is, "They know that an agency exists which watches their every step and will not let them fall. So they abandon their purposeful stride and allow themselves to be carried upon a litter." So just if you have this, if there's this idea that there is this force that's going to come to your rescue no matter what you do, meaning you can't really fail, right? So it doesn't really matter what you do, because whatever you do, you're going to get rescued by this outside force. And then likewise, if you're on the other side of that, which is that no matter this outside force opposes you, and so no matter what you do, the other side has access to this sort of power that's going to come to their aid. No matter what you do, would be very demoralizing, right? And so these two things are going on very much within this book. But I thought this was just really sort of telling it with life in general, because have you ever known anybody that maybe had a young person that was getting into a lot of trouble, and their parents kept bailing them out and bailing them out and bailing them out, and so the kid, the young person doesn't have to really worry about consequences, because no matter what they do, someone's going to fix it for them, right? And so therefore they don't take the initiative to develop themselves, to self-develop. And so that's something that on a societal level, the foundation is really trying to encourage self-development or encourage societal development. And so they don't know for sure if there's this second foundation, but it's important whether or not people think that there is a second foundation. It's important to their people of their own society, and it's important to their enemies, because it gives it just the idea itself is kind of a weapon. So the other thing I'll mention is generally about this book is that it is written in the 1950s, so it is a very important work of the Foundation series. The entire series has been very important in the development of science fiction, specifically in the United States. And it's really was the first of its sort of kind, I think, in this sort of space opera kind of multi sort of book series like this that creates this very intricate sort of universe or galaxy of ideas and of action. But it is very much set in the middle of the 20th century. So, for example, the characters smoke a lot. As was very common, the smoking patterns. The men go off into a room and smoke, and the women go off and do something in another place. And then they read newspapers, they watch television, they're journalists and things like that operate like they did back in the middle of the 20th century in the United States. So, but that did not detract from the enjoyment of this story for me, because the enjoyment of the story was just this idea of the foundation. And even though it does have this sort of feel of 20th century and very, very not, it doesn't feel all that much like it's many thousands of years so far, so many thousands of years into the future that nobody even really remembers Earth anymore. That is so far in the future. Like it's there's not so much of that because it feels very, very familiar, but nevertheless, still very, very enjoyable to me. All right, I think I will leave the main part of the chat there. And just before we move into a few spoilers, I just thought I would mention what I'm going to read next for those of you who are going to be dropping off. The Cloud of Unknowing, which is some spiritual instruction from an anonymous writer of 14th century England. So this was really cool. I already finished it, and I'll have a chat on this coming up soon. So just for a few spoilers, so if you don't want to hear anything about any details about the rest of the book, then you can drop off the video now. But just to get into a few spoilers, namely mainly about the Mule. To me, the Mule is a very interesting character because he's a mutant. He rose in book 2 and developed his own empire after the collapse of the main big galactic empire, and so the Mule is able to control minds, and he's able to do this through emotions, control other people's emotions. The book describes this as being able to control that the emotions are electromagnetic waves and fields, and that therefore the Mule can manipulate those and thereby manipulate the person. I don't really know the science behind that, but it kind of works as far as the story goes. It makes the story really interesting. The Mule can actually do emotional violence to people just by being in their presence, and really serious emotional violence that can cause them pain, like it's very intense pain, even physical pain in that sense. So that was really cool, and the Mule goes on this search for the Second Foundation because the Second Foundation also have these mental powers, it's believed, and so he thinks he has evidence of that. So he really wants to uncover the Second Foundation. I don't think I'll even in this section, I don't think I'll give away exactly what happens with that because it was really kind of fun and interesting. But the second part of the book takes place then 60 years later from the events of the first. So it's 60 years after the Mule. And this is back on the Foundation where there's this group that's actually also trying to uncover the Second Foundation. And for different reasons, though. They feel like the Second Foundation is going to dominate them. And so at least there's that worry. But there's also this idea of actually, do they exist or not? Do they, that's a continuing debate throughout the entire book. There is a character in the second part of the book, Arcady. She's a young woman, young girl. I think she's around 14 years old, and she stows away on this mission where the First Foundation sends this mission, this guy to go do an investigation on a planet where they think the Second Foundation may be, and she stows away there, but she ends up being a real key figure there in uncovering uncovering this whole sort of truth that they're on the search for, which I won't give away even in this spoiler section. So, all right, I think I will leave the chat there. I did enjoy this a lot. I do have plans to at least go ahead and read probably book 4 and maybe even book 5 this year. I'm not sure I'll get through the entire series, but I do plan on getting through a couple of more books in this series this year. So stay tuned for that. Anyway, until next time, take care. Bye.